again. So there's several full circles and a lot of serendipity involved in that. And it's a great pleasure. To begin with, I would like to ask you quite a general question. But going to a literature festival is in many ways like walking into a bookstore and having the books on the shelves sort of tell you about themselves. And so I guess I would like you to begin by telling us a little bit about why you chose to write this latest book, Fly Wild Swans, which in many ways is like writing the story behind writing your other books. And you tell us how Wild Swans came about, and also your other books on Mao, on Cixi, on the Song sisters, and so on. So, what was the reason that you felt that you wanted to kind of tell this backstory?
Okay. For more than 30 years since the publication of Wild Swans, people have always asked me to write a sequel, but I had always resisted the idea because I felt that the events covered in Wild Swans were so dramatic. And after that, there didn't seem to be enough stories to tell. But then in 2023, and I was talking to my mother through video on my phone, and my mother was dying, but I was unable to go back to be with her. And when I saw my mother, lying there very weak and yet still very strong, and then I thought a lot about our past. And then I thought, because Wild Swans ends in 1978, the year I left China to come to go to Britain. I was one of the first people from communist China to leave China to come to the West, because China was beginning to open up. A era had ended, the Mao era. A new era had started by Deng Xiaoping, the era of reforms and the opening China to the outside world. So then I thought of those years, these years since 1978, and I realized that more than 40 years had gone by. And in those more than 40 years, China and my own life had started from being full of hope and dramatic changes for the incredibly better for us in those days, and reaching its peak, and now seem to be dragged backwards into the awful Maoist days. A new era is beginning. So I am, and in that era, there were a lot of things about my mother, about my family, about my own life, because although I live in Britain, I went to China almost every year to see my mother and to research my books, as you say, until fairly recently, 2018. Exactly, when I was absolutely unable to go back to China, and so that's how I decided to write Fly Wild Swans.
Just to clarify for the sake of the audience, why were you unable to go back to China after 2018?
After my biography of Mao, which I co-wrote with my husband, John Halliday. After that book was published, the Chinese regime, tried to ban me from going to China. But I mean, and that would have been impossible for me. And so after a lot of fighting, and the British government helped me and reached a deal with Beijing to allow me to go back every year to see my mother. So I was able to go back from after the publication of Mao the biography from 2005. From 2005 to 2018, I was able to go and see my mother for about 2 years, about 2 weeks every year. And of course, I was under surveillance, close surveillance of the state security. And I was sort of like in a bubble to go to see my mother and then to leave. But in 2018, that became impossible because that year, Chairman Xi Jinping had made himself the permanent supreme leader of China. And one of the very first orders he gave was that anyone who was deemed to have insulted revolutionary heroes should go to prison in China. And because Mao is still like God in China. His portrait is still on Tiananmen. His face is on every Chinese banknote. My book, my biography, which we talked about with my husband, documented Mao's misrule of China. And so obviously, when I go back, I risk going to prison. And so I made the most painful decision of not to try to fight to go back to China, because I feared that one my problem would not be to be able to get him, but to get him, but not to be able to come out.
So your new sort of sequel to your memoir, Fly Wild Swans, shares a lot in common with the original memoir. The name, of course, which was Wild Swans, and now it's Fly Wild Swans, but also the other protagonists, your mother, your father, your grandmother, Chairman Mao in some ways. And the other protagonist that is in both of the memoirs, and in many ways, I think still holds center stage in being very compelling. I lived in China. I was teaching over 20 years. This would be in the early 2000s. And I would, I became quite close to them and I would try and talk to them about the Cultural Revolution quite often. And essentially, they were open to talking about it, but they knew very little about it because their parents did not talk about it. It was just like a taboo topic at home. And it was interesting to me as an Indian coming from New Delhi because we didn't have a cultural revolution, but in 1947 we had a partition of the country in which 1 million people died, and most of the people who live in New Delhi today, a lot of them are refugees from what is today Pakistan. But again, there was this veil of silence, and people in my generation knew very little about it because parents and grandparents didn't talk about it. What do you think was behind this reluctance to really talk about the details of the Cultural Revolution, which you yourself did, and yours was one of millions of families, but you told the story, millions have not?
Yes. Well, I think for me, for 10 years, after I came to Britain, I didn't want to talk about it because it was simply too painful. In the Cultural Revolution, my beloved grandma, who had brought us up, died as a result. And my father was one of the few who stood up to Mao and protested against the Cultural Revolution. So as a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane, and he was exiled to a camp and died tragically. And my mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father, and she refused. So as a result, she was put through those ghastly denunciation meetings, which was an everyday sight in China at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, especially. The Cultural Revolution started in 1966 and ended 10 years later when Mao died. And in those years, my mother, like other victims, will be put on a stage like this, and their arms will be ferociously pushed to the back, and their heads were pushed down, and they were kicked and beaten. And my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. And I remember, picking out these sort of fragments of glass from her knees with my grandmother. And everybody in China went through those ghastly denunciation meetings as victims or witnesses. And so those were just too painful. And I just didn't want to think about it. So I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to write about it. But in 1988, 10 years after I settled in Britain, my mother came to stay with me. And for the first time, she told me the stories of her life and stories of my grandmother and my father. And once my mother started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months and she talked every day. And when I was out working, she talked into a tape recorder. So by the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recording. And so, and after my mother was gone, I sat down and transcribed the tapes, and I started writing Wild Swans. And I think my mother inspired me to write this book and that book. And also my mother seemed to know that uh, writing is where my heart and my talent lay. And she was encouraging me to fulfill my dreams. And indeed, I mean, my mother was the person who gave me, my career as a writer. So that's how I came to write Wild Swans.
So this is actually a related question to do with your mother and her resilience. Because the one thing that always struck me about Chinese people of a certain demographic, if I met somebody as old as your mother, I believe she's in her 90s now. So if I were to meet somebody in their 90s in China 10 years ago, I would sort of look at them and think about the kind of epochal shifts they had seen in their own life when they had gone from sort of imperial China to communist China to the craziness of the Cultural Revolution to sort of Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up to China today. And at each stage, it's kind of like whiplash, because the changes are so enormous and there's so many decades of changes that have been compressed into very short periods of time. And I always wondered about the psychological resilience of people. Like, how is it that they haven't gone mad? Because if any normal human being had to kind of constantly adjust and recalibrate their minds to these kinds of almost 180-degree changes, they would almost fracture. And then I would see Chinese people and they were, living their lives. They were happy, they were resilient. So can you speak a little bit about the emotional and psychological resilience of people in China, your mom included?
Well, I think both my mother and my grandmother were quite extraordinary women. I think they didn't just survive, they often went against the tide and fought against the fate they were put in. Which made their lives more dramatic. And they were fighters. My grandmother, for example, when she was 2 years old, her feet were crushed and bound to produce the ghastly, 3-inch golden lilies. I mean, in fact, my mother, if I might deviate a bit, when my mother was staying with me in London, one day we were in Hyde Park, we were walking, and my mother suddenly stopped and pointed at a round, flat stone and said to me, "Look at that. It's just like the kind of millstone which people used to use to crush a baby girl's feet to create those 3-inch golden lilies. And then my mom and I had no idea how this was foot binding had been done, because when I was a child, I had seen my grandmother's feet, when when she washed her feet, and I just saw that only the big toe was normal and the other 4 toes were lifeless. There were no, as though there were no stones in them, and they were crushed under the arch. And but I didn't know how this happened. So my mother told me, and this was one of the things for me to want to write about wild swans and write about the pains and the strength my grandmother had. But because it was also on those crushed, crippled, bound feet that my grandma kidnapped her daughter and started a new life, because my grandma was given by her father to a warlord general, the police chief of Beijing in the early 1920s, to give to the man to be his concubine. My mother was not allowed to call her mother, and she had to call the proper wife mother. And so my grandma thought she would lose her daughter. So one day she kidnapped my mother, the baby, and she fled. In 1989, I went to China to research wild swans, and my mother took me to the place. And then I realized how difficult it was for my grandma to do this, because the road from the mansion, a well-guarded mansion, to the railway station was very long, and the road was very rough, full of spiky rocks. And yet my grandmother was on these sort of on those road with her baby girl, and was sustained by one thought that she mustn't lose her daughter. And so grandma was, I appreciated her very much, and far more than before. And I appreciated how she died, actually, also in great pain, because how much suffering my mother was put through. And my mother, of course, just her behavior in the Cultural Revolution, refused to denounce my father when countless spouses denounced wives, denounced their husbands. And because if my mother just denounced my father, she would have had an easy life. And so I think that's how they survived the Cultural Revolution, by fighting. Um, and I hope that answered your question. And they yes, I think they were quite extraordinary women, and Ma was sort of, in a way, my my um my kind of my role model and my example for how to live through extreme adversity.
The story of your mother and your grandmother is also something that you tell in Wild Swans, the original Wild Swans. In this book, though, you take the story forward, and you also, for example, talking about the 1980s and what happened under Deng Xiaoping during the reform and opening up period, when China began to liberalize the strict communist control that it had and allow a kind of entrepreneurial spirit to be unleashed. And yeah, I mean, for me, living in China, I've always wondered what it must have been like, because Chinese to me seem like the epitome of entrepreneurs. I always say that they can sell chicken feet to a vegetarian and contact lenses to a blind person if they have to, because they're consummate entrepreneurs and salespeople. And these energies must have been repressed under Mao and during the Communist Revolution. However, you then have the 1980s and you suddenly have this explosion. And I love your chapter when you're talking about visiting Chengdu in the early days with an American, I can't remember, businessman called Clive, perhaps, an Englishman called Clive, and all the various people who kind of lined up to talk to him about business proposals. I'm going to read very quickly 3 sentences from here to give a sense of what kind of business proposals. So it was like people came to ask for what they would like to have or what they had heard about. Could Clive, the first and only Westerner they had ever encountered, help them set up an airline, build hovercrafts for the Yangtze, mine the Himalayas for marble, or construct an amusement park like Disneyland? So, I mean, what does this speak about the Chinese spirit, this kind of irrepressible, wide ranging entrepreneurialism that you also capture in those chapters?
Yes, well, I mean, yes, I was very pleased that I went with this businessman in China, and they were the very first Westerners, people in Chengdu, the city I came from, in Chengdu, had encountered. I went with this English businessman, and one day we were in the market. He was sort of bending down to select some apples. Then he felt his bottom was stroked. He thought, wow, in China, and he stood up and saw the 2 middle-aged women were stroking him for the cashmere coat he was wearing, and they didn't regard him as a human being. So, and so Clive then stuck his hand out and said, "I'm Clive," 我是克莱夫. And these 2 women looked at each other and fled in giggles.
We've talked a lot about your mother and your grandmother, and again, they've been these huge influences on your life. But what about your father? I think, he also comes across as a remarkably complex personality. Why do you think he remained so loyal to the Communist Party for so long? Like, can you unpack his psyche for us and tell us his story a little bit?
Well, my father became a communist when he was a 17-year-old, working as a shop assistant in a bookshop. And he was influenced by the left-wing books, and he became a communist. And he became a communist because he had experienced injustice and corruption and the hunger. He lived for many years in hunger, and he thought the communists would provide a better world. And so that's how he became a communist. And he became fiercely loyal to the party. I won't go into the details, but until the Great Famine in China between 1958 and 1961, roughly 40 million people died of starvation. And that was a watershed for my parents and for a lot of other communists. Because I remember very well when I was a child, and my father said to me with great agitation in his face and said, why did we make revolution? We make revolution because people were starving, and we want people not to starve. And then during the Great Famine, when these tens of millions of people died, and, my father became disillusioned with the party. I mean, why they were so disillusioned? Because my parents then realized that the party created the Great Famine. The Great Famine was not the result of bad weather, and was not the result of even economic mismanagement, as I thought. Mao actually knew the famine would take place if he carried out his policy, because basically Mao had this ambition from 1949, when he became the master of China, and he wanted to turn China into a military superpower so he could dominate the world, which is the dream Xi Jinping inherited from Mao. And so Mao actually, he knew the food, he was exporting food. He knew that China could not feed its people, and people were dependent on this food for survival. But he didn't care. And he even said for all his projects to take off, half of China may have to die. So that was, well, I discovered these facts when I was researching the biography of Mao. So that's why my father became disillusioned. He didn't speak up during the famine. I won't go into details, but he decided to speak up in the Cultural Revolution because they found that the famine had, it was unacceptable.
So you have mentioned on the stage here and somewhere in the book as well that under the current chairman Xi Jinping, you feel that China is being pulled back into a Maoist hell. But as you've also documented, under Mao, people were starving, people didn't have food, there was complete chaos. And today in China, you have it's a leader in artificial intelligence. It's got some of the best research in the world. It's exporting green energy around. People's living standards have risen immeasurably. Would you still believe that this is really a Maoist hell that he's dragging people back into?
Well, those economic developments all happened after Mao died in 1976, and because Mao had died. I mean, the liberalization was not because China was becoming more communist, but because China was rejecting the sort of a Maoist communism and becoming more liberal. And so this liberalization started from 1978 when I left China. I left China because of the liberalization. I was able to leave China, and I was one of the first Chinese to leave China to come to the West. And when I first came, we came in a group of 14 people. We were all wearing the Mao suit. We were not allowed to go out on our own. We had to move in a group. So we were quite a sight in the London streets. And then so that was a completely different world. In this book, Fly Wild Swans, I documented China's changes from the 1978 to how the country developed and so on. They were more and more liberalization was happening, and more liberalization was not because not because of communism, but because the Chinese leaders were trying to move China towards the backward Mao states, often not with success. So in spite of all the effort, actually, China, there was a tremendous resistance for China to become a more Maoist country.
So we have 10 minutes for a Q&A, and I would love to open it up to our audience. I'm sure many people have many things to ask Jung Chang. I see a man right at the back over there. If we can start with him. Yes.
Very moving, ma'am. I read a similar book, Life and Death in Shanghai by Jung Chang. My question to you is, what are the Chinese people seeing? China's image has got whitewashed overseas, becoming a great superpower economically also. But what about the people? Are they in revolt, or they are happy, or what is your sense of it?
Since China, I think Life and Death in Shanghai is not is also a record of what life was like in China during the Cultural Revolution. And there were many other personal memoirs. I mean, you know, all memoirs tell the same story, how awful that period was. And there was a determination in the Chinese population that, you know, they don't want to go back to the bad old days. I mean, even though young people were being brainwashed in schools and by the, you know, the media and the books, which are now increasingly under censorship, not to talk about the Cultural Revolution. And in spite of all that, China has not made big steps backwards towards the Cultural Revolution. So that is something that gives me hope. I think in spite of the brainwashing, the effort of Xi's policies, I mean, there is still actually, he's achieved relatively little, which is why if you go to China, you see actually the place has remained irrevocably changed from the old days.
Ma'am, I just want to know from you, uh, till mid 80s, India and China were almost at the same footing so far as the per capita income and the level of development is concerned. But at the present is way ahead to India in scientific development, in economic progress, and their level of living. So, what is the reason, from your point of view, India lagging behind China?
Yes. Yes, I think this, you know, I mean, China seems to have made great headways, or has made great headways. I mean, just the visual sight of a city, the two countries look very different. I think there is maybe something in the culture, if I say. I think the Chinese are very much wanting to get ahead, to be better, to make more money. And I mean, once my husband asked me, in English, there was an expression, keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, do you have a similar expression in China? I thought about it, and I think there is an expression, but it says, overtake the Joneses. So the Chinese, once they were given the liberty to be rich, to live a better life, they grabbed the opportunity and really worked, you know, like anything. I mean, during the years when I was going back to China, and in the 1980s, when during the reforms, 1990s, and I was also traveling. I was also coming to India, and I noticed one thing, that in Chinese hotels, you have everybody glued to their mobiles, or in the old days, you know, this larger chunker version of the mobiles, talking business, making enterprises, and talking about making money. But in India, most hotels were having weddings. And so I thought that was I think perhaps one of the reasons was that the Chinese under Mao had been so poor, so dirt poor. We're not talking about one section of the society. We're talking about the whole country living such an awful life. I mean, you know, for example, by the time I left China, three generations of a family lived under one roof, in one room. I mean, you know, they lived through starvation, political persecution, and everything. I mean, the desire to change, I think probably was much stronger than people in India. And also Chinese culture, the Confucian culture encouraged the people, to get ahead. And I think that's very important.
Could you please tell us whether the average Chinese person is happy now or conscious of repression and unable to express their unhappiness because of repression?
Well, I think, well, happiness is a difficult thing to say. You can have the most affluent life. You can still